So big news going on in Ukraine. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So the big news this week from Ukraine is that it appears the Ukrainians have finally launched the long-anticipated southern offensive. Let's check out the map over here. So you can see based on the map all the different areas where the Russians have been trying to invade. Over here, over here, over here. All the way down here. These are all the areas that the Russians have been pushing. Not making much progress, by the way. But then you get down to the south here, and you can see the push by the Ukrainians here. Let's just kind of zoom in a little bit. Now, this area is in the southern part of Ukraine. This is what's called the Kherson Oblast. And down here, you can see the city of Kherson. That's the largest city that has been occupied by the Russians. It was occupied very early on in the invasion for the simple fact that it's very close to Crimea, which you can see right here. This is Crimea over here. In fact, I'll just zoom out a little bit so you can see right here is Crimea, here is Kherson. So it was an easy location, essentially, for the Russians to take. What's more is they tended to have their higher quality troops down there as opposed to the ones who were involved in the invasion up north of Kyiv. Now, they did take control of this area here, and there's been talk by the Russians that they're going to hold some kind of referendum, which you know what that means, where they're going to determine whether the Kherson Oblast, allowing them to illegally annex the area the way they did in Crimea. Now, what's been interesting about this, though, as you can see, there's this massive river here, what's called the Danipro River, which is basically an incredibly large barrier between the more Russian-controlled areas down here, including Crimea, and the Ukrainian area up here, which is the reason why the Ukrainians have targeted this as their first area for a counteroffensive. As it turns out, and let's zoom in a little bit here, there are only a couple of bridges over the Danipro River, and they include a dam over here, a railroad bridge here, and the famous Antonivka Bridge over here. These two bridges have essentially been destroyed or severely damaged, and the Ukrainians don't want to destroy this dam because of the fact that then it would create essentially a flood that would damage and potentially threaten the lives of thousands of people in Kherson down here. But they have been able to essentially destroy some of the road leading up to it. The Russians then have tried to build a pontoon bridge next to the Antonivka Bridge across the river, but that has also come under attack. And the net result has been the fact that the Ukrainians had moved up to 25,000 soldiers into this area, and these soldiers are now largely isolated, unable to be resupplied or reinforced. And in fact, the word is that the Russians have moved their headquarters out of Kherson across the river. So there isn't even a Russian headquarters in this area anymore. Well, reports are, despite what we see on the map here, that actually there are three areas that the Ukrainians have been pushing forward. One is here, towards the dam. One is down here, which you can see they've already taken back some areas here toward Kherson. And then one is up in the north, where you also see that they've been able to take back some areas as well. I think the Ukrainians would really like to see this whole area taken before winter comes in, because winter really slows down potential military operations. Word is, by the way, the Ukrainians have already essentially breached the first of the Russians' defensive lines, and there are only three. So 2 more to go. And if they succeed, this would be both a massive propaganda blow and a massive strategic blow, because of course, the dam over here actually supplies a lot of fresh water and electricity to, you guessed it, Crimea down here. So that would be a big problem to the Russians. Now, while we're looking at the map over here, I think it's worth pointing out, we've heard a lot about the nuclear reactor, the Zaporizhia nuclear reactor, which really has people kind of freaking out for fear that it could turn into another Chernobyl. The Russians have kind of been playing this up, taking the nuclear reactor off of the grid. And that's a problem, because you have to remember, nuclear power basically works by generating an incredible amount of heat, so you constantly need to be cooling down the reactors. When the reactors are not properly cooled down, that's when everything melts, and you have, you guessed it, a meltdown. That's the disaster that we want to avoid. Now, the way that they avoid a meltdown is by essentially cooling these reactors continually with water, which is why, by the way, you frequently see nuclear reactors located right by large bodies of water, as you do here. Taking the plant off of the electric grid, though, makes it so that the pumps that are used to pump the water to cool the nuclear reactor might not be able to continue. So that's where the threat is. Now, Russians have been accusing the Ukrainians of causing problems here. Ukrainians have been accusing the Russians. Let's just do a little logical game here to figure out who's probably telling the truth. Just where is this nuclear reactor located? Well, let's zoom in a little bit. It is way over here. Look how far away it is from the area that the Ukrainians are fighting to take back right now. Look how far away it is from Kherson. In fact, we can even check the distance on this map. So again, here's where the reactor is. Here's where the Ukrainian offensive is. It's 41 kilometers, basically 25 miles. This is nowhere near where the Ukrainians are conducting their operations. What's more is I think it's important to note that, again, you've got this dam here, which, frankly, the Ukrainians could destroy, and it would really basically make it possible for them to take back this territory relatively quickly. They haven't done that, though, because of the potential for civilian deaths. So do you really think the Ukrainians are the ones who are threatening this? I think it's fair to say that the Russians are basically using this as a base for some of their artillery because they know that the Ukrainians are going to fire back there. And what's more then is Putin's basically playing a game of nuclear brinksmanship to essentially threaten the rest of the world, which of course has been so supportive of the Ukrainians in this war. We have a couple other pieces of news that I think are kind of exciting. One is that the Pope, for the first time, has recognized the fact that, in fact, the Russians are the aggressors. This is not simply an example of two forces with equal culpability struggling over certain territory. No, this is an example of unwarranted, illegal aggression on the part of the Russians, and the Pope has recognized that. One more story, and I love this one, is that the Ukrainians have essentially been building wooden versions of the American-supplied HIMARS trucks. These trucks, of course, are the launching point for missiles that have been so destructive for the Russians behind their lines, destroying ammunition depots, fuel depots, and command centers, as well, of course, as the bridges that we mentioned down here. Why have they been building these wooden decoys? Well, because the Russians are absolutely going berserk over HIMARS. It's caused a major problem for them and is a big part of the reason why they've been unable to really advance since they made some progress taking the Luhansk region in the Far East. Since they've basically been stalled, and the Ukrainians have been extremely effective in their use of the HIMARS rockets. So the Russians want to target those trucks and their crews very seriously. Well, as a result of these decoys, what have the Russians done? Well, they've sent their cruise missiles out to blow them up. Cruise missiles, you have to understand, are expensive pieces of high-tech equipment, something that the Russians have relatively few of and really don't have the ability to replace. As a result, each time they send one of these cruise missiles to blow up one of these decoys, which apparently they've done at least 10 times according to reports, that's one more cruise missile that's not able to attack, say, Ukrainian civilians in a city or Ukrainian forces on the march. A big win for Ukrainians. The point of all this is it just shows that we have more good news coming out of Ukraine. I continue to be cautiously optimistic that before the winter sets in, we're going to see some serious movement in Ukraine that will really send a strong message that the U.S. and our allies are doing the right thing in supporting the Ukrainian people in their defense of their territory. Well, if you want to find out more about how the Ukrainians have been fighting against the Russians, check out this video I did over here, where it talks about the Ukrainian resistance, which has had some real successes lately, including in Crimea. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.